In today's video, I will give you an update on my antique ironing board cabinet, as well as show you its step-by-step restoration. Along the way, I journalized every step in the restoration of my ironing board cabinet, beginning with the day it arrived. It took some time to unpack this treasure, but once unpacked, I felt it was one of the best purchases I made in my vintage collecting life. Other than the door being unattached, the cabinet arrived in one piece. Once unpacked, I photographed it from every angle for posterity. The next day, I began the process of stripping it, knowing this would be no easy task. The first application of citrus strip, I waited 45 minutes for it to process. After some time, the paint bubbled and blistered. I then began scraping off the first layer. It was then I noticed the paint was several layers thick, with only a light coat covering the perimeter of the cabinet. A second, then a third coat of citrus strip was applied. The last was allowed to process overnight, but it would be 2 days later when I scraped this coat off, then applied a fourth, allowing to process overnight. In the meantime, I posted a short video on YouTube about my ironing board cabinet as one of 2 summer projects. The next day, August 10th, I scraped off the previous night's application. By this time, I could clearly see the wood. I also was able to remove the hinges, screws, and side panel to get between it and the door, to apply the first coat of citrus strip and another coat on the door and side panel. The hinges, screws, and doorknob were then placed in a solution of white vinegar, salt, and baking soda to remove years of debris. This solution would later be used on the rusted metal bars holding the boards. This worked some in conjunction with the citrus strip to remove the paint splatters on the bars. The next evening, I checked the previous night's application and could clearly see the wood, but it would take at least one more application to fully complete. This application was applied to the side panel, door, and cabinet, then removed, but a little more citrus strip was applied and followed up with mineral spirits, which lifted the paint residue embedded in the wood. Stripping was complete. In the end, it would take 7 applications of stripper to remove the paint. I also checked the progress of the hinges, screws, and knob. The pieces made the vinegar, salt, and baking soda solution cloudy. The pieces were then washed and rinsed off, but one hinge still had paint, rust, and debris on it, where it could not be fully moved back and forth. After drying the pieces, they were put back in the cup, and what was left of the citrus strip was applied to remove the remaining debris. The doorknob looked good, but a little citrus strip was also applied to it to remove the remaining paint. Later, I cleaned the citrus strip off the hinges and screws and used a flossing pick to clean in the screw slots. There was green and black gunk on the pieces, which were then soaked in water and dawn overnight. After 4 days of soaking, I rinsed the hinges and screws, dried the pieces well, then polished each piece with Brasso, where the pieces looked brand new and ready for reinstallment on the cabinet. A few days later, I removed a screw and a nut from the inside of the door, which I was able to reuse, as well as removing 5 2-inch nails from the door joint. 2 days later, I removed the bottom portion of the cabinet. The wood was badly damaged, but with a few hits of the hammer, it easily came off. I also removed a rusty nail in the wood as well. I would then take this piece with me to the lumber store to be duplicated, along with a sketch of the top of the door. The next day, I finished sanding the door and the side panel, then shot a video on the completion of the stripping of the ironing board cabinet, then uploaded it to YouTube. August 23rd, I began applying enamel to the cabinet door, and over the next few days on the top and the sides of it, which all had to be removed along with the stain due to the product's reaction to the old latex paint, which had been on the cabinet for years. I used mineral spirits and white vinegar to remove these products and decided to leave the cabinet bare. While sanding the back of the cabinet where it was splintering, I discovered there were 2 other backs for a total of 3. The more I sanded, the more it splintered. So I decided to put another panel over it, which measured 68¼ inches in length without the bottom panel, 13 7/8 in width, converting to 5.67 feet long. In the listing for the ironing board cabinet, the dimensions were 70 inches high with the bottom panel, 14 inches wide with a 3-inch depth, and weighed 36 pounds. The ironing board cabinet was made in the 1930s in the U.S. and is stamped with a Chinook Indian on the inside top of the cabinet and stamped again under the sleeve board with the Chinook Indian and reads stock number, though one is not listed. The Howard Adjustable Cabinet Ironing Board patented. Further research on this piece produced nothing, but I did speak to a librarian in the reference department of the main library in my city who offered several suggestions. She recommended I look over some Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward's catalogs from the late 19th century on microfilm, which gave me the idea to look through the 1893 and 1895 delineators and 1902 designer catalogs I have. I also flipped through my 1944 and 1946 House Beautiful magazines to see what I could uncover. But there was no advertisement for ironing board cabinets or anything related to ironing. The librarian further recommended I track down some restoration hobbyists of antique and vintage pieces. I finished sanding the cabinet, sleeve, and ironing board, touching up various areas on the pieces, removing more paint splatters. I used some vinegar on the metal to remove the rust, which worked a little, but I still used a bit of citrus strip. I also tightened the screws of the bar and handle on the sleeve board, then sanded the front curves of both boards as well as any spots, paint splatters, and rough spots. I then reattached the knob and the hinges to the door. The side panel was reattached to the door using 2-inch screws securing both pieces to the cabinet. With measurements for the back panel, a sketch of the top panel, and the original bottom panel in hand, I headed to the lumber store. Thinking everything would go smoothly, I could begin the project the very next day. This would not be the case. Instead, I found myself returning to the lumber store 2 more times to get things corrected. First, the top panel was off by half an inch, then the back panel was split down the middle in several places with a manufacturer's stamp all over it, not to mention a half-moon-shaped wood hole at the top of the board on the reverse side. Though video footage of the damaged back panel was taken, it was lost. So I took the top panel back and had the half-inch sawed off and replaced the back panel. Wouldn't you know it, in preparing to stain then attach the back panel, I discovered it was 2 3/4 inch short on the bottom, which meant I had to return to the lumber store for this piece, as well as some liquid nail and a caulking gun. Items the original salesman didn't bother to tell me I needed. I couldn't believe the comedy of errors I was experiencing with this lumber store. While at the store, I also picked up some wood filler to put on top of the 2 3/4 inch piece in the back panel. When I returned home, I stained it and left it outside overnight to dry, forgetting the back panel also had to be done. That's just how frustrated I was and how badly I wanted to complete this project. The next day, I checked on it. It looked good and had dried nicely. I then glued it and the back panel to the cabinet, then puttied the pieces to conceal the break between them, then left the cabinet outside to dry for several hours. Later, the back of the cabinet was reinforced with number 6 1 1/4 inch construction screws for reinforcement. I chose the screws instead of nails because the nails were not going in easily without splintering the cabinet. In the midst of all this, I drilled holes in the new bottom panel using the original one as a template by laying it on top to create holes, which worked out well. Using my drill, I then screwed the new panel onto the cabinet, but the screws only went in part of the way, so I used a Phillips screwdriver to screw them in further. The final steps in this momentous restoration included attaching the top panel to the cabinet and making a cover for the sleeve board. The top panel was attached using E6000 and hot glue for support. The sleeve board cover was made from vintage blue and white striped cotton fabric. Batting is also on the board to protect it, and so the cover has a cushion underneath. The cover was made by pressing a piece of pattern paper on the sleeve board, making an imprint. Next, a muslin pattern was made, then half-inch seam allowance added. I cut 2 pieces, then placed wrong sides together, serged the edges, then turned the cover out and pressed it. I then made buttonholes on the bottom of the cover 3 inches from each side and half an inch apart. I then sewed a straight stitch on top of the serging stitch to make a casing for the cotton cord. I attached a safety pin to the cord, snaked it through the casing, then knotted it off. Project complete, at least for now. Though the original plan was to mount the ironing board cabinet to the wall, instead I have elected to have a cabinet built for it, to include bookshelves for my sewing books and extra storage for my other sewing accoutrements. An endeavor currently in the works and once completed will be shared with all of you. If this project has taught me anything, it would be patience, even in the midst of the lumber store debacle. Restorations of any kind are an art and cannot be rushed. A project of this magnitude required extra love, care, and attention. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. And until next time, wherever you are in the world, be good to yourself and to others.